All right, ready to dive into some philosophy. Today, we're tackling reism.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's all about getting down to, like, what really exists.
They're really real.
Haha, exactly. Kind of like, are we just surrounded by illusions? Or is there some solid ground of reality? Think you're up for this philosophical deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. Always up for a challenge. Where are we starting?
Straight to the source for this one, we're going with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Nice, a classic. So you know it'll be good stuff.
No fluff here. We'll break down the key ideas of Reism, see where it came from historically, and maybe even wrestle with some of the arguments for and against it. Sound good?
I'm in. Lead the way.
All right, so first things first. What exactly is Reism?
Well, in a nutshell, Reism is the belief that only things really exist.
Okay, so not just like my coffee cup and my chair.
Well, those two, haha. But it's more about saying that everything that exists can be boiled down to the category of thing.
Interesting. So everything is a thing, but what exactly makes something a thing in this sense?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting because the interpretation of what qualifies as a thing can vary, and that's where a lot of the debate around Reism comes in.
I can see how that would get tricky. So it's not as simple as it sounds at first.
Not at all. It's deceptively simple, I guess you could say.
So where did this whole idea of only things existing even come from? Is this a new thing?
Not at all, actually. Reism has a surprisingly long history, going back centuries.
Yeah.
You can even trace it back to ancient philosophy.
Really? Who was talking about this way back then?
Well, the Stoics, for example, they had this strong emphasis on the material world, on the things we can perceive. And in the Middle Ages, you had doctrines of singularia focusing on individual, concrete entities.
So those singularia, those were all about the specifics, right? Not just some general idea of horseness, but each individual horse.
You got it. And later on, you see hints of Reism in thinkers like Hobbes.
Oh yeah, Hobbes. Wasn't he all about bodies and stuff?
Exactly. He focused on corpora, which is basically just a fancy word for bodies. And then there was Leibniz with his fascinating ideas about monads, those ultimate indivisible units of reality.
So it's like philosophers were circling around this idea for a long time, but it hadn't quite coalesced into a full-blown philosophy yet.
I like that, coalesced. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, it was kind of simmering in the background.
Until someone came along and turned up the heat.
Exactly, and that someone was Franz Brentano. He's considered a key figure in the development of Reism.
Brentano.
Yep.
Okay, he's the one who really put Reism on the map. What was his big contribution?
Well, for Brentano, it all started with his rejection of what he called entia rationis.
Entia rationis. That sounds intimidating.
It's basically a fancy term for objects of thought, things like concepts, ideas, mathematical objects.
Okay, so like the stuff that's in our heads.
Right. Brentano believed these things existed only in the mind. He drew a sharp line between those mental objects and the real things that actually exist out there in the world.
So he's saying there's a big difference between the thought of a tree and an actual tree.
Exactly. He called the real existing entities things, and those mental constructs, the entia rationis, he labeled irrealia. For Brentano, being is equal to real things, no abstract fluff allowed.
Got it. No room for fuzzy concepts, just hardcore reality. But hold on, if abstract ideas aren't real, how did Brentano even talk about them?
Good question. He had to find a way to address those concepts without actually granting them real existence.
Sounds like a philosophical tightrope walk.
It kind of was. He came up with some clever workarounds. For instance, instead of saying redness is a color, he might say some colored things are red.
Ah, I see. So instead of talking about redness as this abstract concept, he's shifting the focus to actual red-colored objects.
You got it. He grounds the idea in concrete examples. It's a subtle shift, but it allowed him to speak about these concepts without committing to their real existence.
This is really making me think differently about how we use language. It's like there are all these hidden assumptions baked into the way we talk.
Absolutely, and that's a big part of what racism makes you do. It forces you to examine language more closely and really think about what those words are actually referring to.
It's kind of mind-blowing. But I have to admit, even I'm having a hard time swallowing the idea that abstract concepts just don't exist.
Yeah, I get that. It goes against some pretty deeply ingrained intuitions. But Brentano had another trick up his sleeve for dealing with this issue. He argued that those terms for entia rationis, the abstract ones, weren't actually true names.
So if they weren't names, what were they?
He saw them more like logical connectors, like tools for linking together statements about real things. So instead of a name pointing to a real thing, it's a way of establishing relationships between those real things.
Okay, so he found a way to talk about these abstract concepts without giving them too much weight. He's saying they're useful tools, but not actual things themselves.
Right. Brentano was really innovative in how he tackled these issues, laying the groundwork for future explorations of reism. But there's another key figure we should talk about, Tadeusz Kołobrzewski. He took Brentano's ideas and developed his own unique version of reism.
Kołobrzewski. Okay, before we get to him, though, let me just take a second to connect this back to our listener. Why should they care about all of this?
Yeah, that's important.
What's the takeaway for someone who might be listening and thinking, okay, that's some interesting philosophy, but what does it have to do with me?
That's a great question. I think even if you don't end up a full-fledged Reist, this idea really makes you think about some fundamental questions, like what does it mean for something to exist? And how much of what we talk about is actually rooted in reality? It challenges us to think critically about those abstract concepts we use all the time.
So it's not just some abstract philosophical game. It has implications for how we understand the world, how we use language. It's about getting to the core of what's real.
Absolutely. Now, back to Kołobrzewski. He had his own way of categorizing being, dividing it into things, states of affairs, relations, and properties.
Okay, that's different from Brentano's bodies and souls.
It is. Kołobrzewski really wanted to simplify things. To make his point crystal clear, he laid out two core theses of reism.
Theses. Sounds serious.
They are, in a way. The first one, which he called R1, states that any object is a thing. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I can follow that. What's the second thesis?
R2 gets more specific. It says, no object is a state of affairs, relation, or property.
Okay, so he's drawing a very clear line here. Things exist, and they are definitely not those other categories. So what are they then, according to Kołobrzewski? What does he consider a thing?
For him, things ultimately boiled down to material bodies. He even had a term for it, pansomatism.
Pansomism. I love it. So everything is a body. But wait, where does that leave things like ideas or concepts? It seems like he's running into the same problem as Brentano.
You're right, he is. And he addressed it in a similar way with what he called semantic reism. It's all about how we use language.
Okay, let me guess.
Yeah.
He's going to find a way to talk about those abstract concepts without actually saying they exist.
Exactly. He makes the distinction between what he calls genuine names and non-genuine names.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
Genuine names, according to Kołobrzewski, are those that refer to concrete things, those material bodies we were talking about. Non-genuine names are the ones we use for those abstract concepts.
Gotcha. So like tree would be a genuine name, but justice wouldn't.
You got it.
Yeah.
And he argues that only sentences containing those genuine names have a truly literal meaning. So to give you an example, he'd say that a sentence like, wisdom is a property of some people.
Okay.
That needs to be rephrased because wisdom and property, those are non-genuine names. He'd argue that you could say some people are wise, which uses only genuine names.
Ah, so he's grounding the idea of wisdom in concrete individuals, not treating it as this abstract entity.
Exactly. By shifting the focus to concrete examples and avoiding those non-genuine names, he thought we could avoid a lot of philosophical confusion.
I see. It's all about using language more precisely, making sure every word is pointing to something real, something tangible.
Didn't he have a special term for those non-genuine names, the misleading ones?
Oh, you're thinking of onomatoids.
Onomatoids, that's it. They sound kind of scary, like philosophical monsters.
Ah, a little bit. But yeah, for Kołobrzewski, those onomatoids were the real troublemakers in language. They pretend to be genuine names, tricking us into thinking these abstract things exist.
So his whole project is about cleaning up our language, getting rid of those pesky onomatoids.
In a way, yeah. He wanted to get rid of those terms that might lead us astray in our thinking. Interestingly, he was influenced by a formal system called Lejewski's calculus of names, which really emphasized the importance of names referring to specific objects. So that calculus provided a kind of logical framework for his semantic reism. It's all connected. But, I have to imagine this whole reism thing, even with all its careful distinctions, probably has its fair share of critics.
Oh, you better believe it. It's a bold and controversial idea. There are definitely some objections.
Okay, so hit me with it. What are some of the main arguments against reism? What do the critics say?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is what's often called the self-referential problem.
Self-referential.
Yeah.
Okay, help me out here.
Remember Kotorbisky's second thesis, R2? The one that defines what a thing is not.
Oh yeah, the no object is a state of affairs, relation, or property one.
Right. Well, the problem is the very definition seems to be using the very terms it claims don't exist.
Ah, I see. It's like he's using the forbidden language to define the rules of the language.
Exactly. And this is a major challenge for reism. Kotorbisky tried to address this issue by separating semantic reism from ontological reism.
Hold on. Semantic versus ontological. What's the distinction there?
So, semantic reism is all about language, the way we should speak, the terms we should use. Ontological reism deals with what actually exists.
Okay, so he's saying, look, we might have to use those abstract terms in language sometimes, but that doesn't mean they refer to actual things out there in the world.
That's the idea. But whether that distinction really holds up is a matter of debate.
It seems like a pretty fine line to walk, and I bet there are other criticisms too, right?
Oh, definitely. Another big one is just the sheer difficulty of applying reism to certain fields of knowledge.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, it seems to work okay for chairs and tables, but what about more abstract areas like math, logic, or the humanities?
Yeah, if only material things exist, how do you explain numbers, logical principles, or the concept of beauty? That seems like a tough one for reism to handle.
You're right, it is. And even Kosurbisky admitted that reism had its limitations. He saw it more as a program, a way of approaching philosophical problems than a complete, perfect theory.
So he recognized that reism wasn't the be-all, end-all answer.
He did. Which, I think shows intellectual honesty. It's okay to acknowledge that a theory might not have all the answers.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we move on, can we just do a quick recap just to make sure everyone's on the same
Yeah,
page?
that sounds good.
So, realism is this idea that only things exist, and by things we mean concrete material entities, right?
Exactly. It's a very particular way of looking at what's real.
And we saw how two key thinkers, Brentano and Kotorbisky, each developed this idea in their own ways.
Mm.
Brentano focused on separating real things from those mental objects, those entia rationis.
Right.
He argued that even when we talk about abstract concepts, we're ultimately referring back to concrete things or actions.
And then Kotorbisky took it a step further with his idea of pansomatism, claiming that everything is essentially a material body. And he developed this whole system of semantic reism, where we have to use language very carefully to avoid those misleading abstract terms, those, what were they called?
Onomatoids. Don't forget the onomatoids.
Haha, right. But of course, we also saw that reism has its critics, and those criticisms are important. There's the self-referential problem, where it seems to contradict itself, and there's the challenge of applying it to fields that deal with abstract concepts.
Yeah, some pretty big hurdles to clear. But even with those challenges, reism really forces us to think critically about what we consider real and how our language can influence our thinking. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. If reism is right, and only those material things exist, what happens to the whole world of ideas?
Ooh, that's a big one.
What about concepts like mind, justice, or beauty? What do those become if there's no room for abstract entities?
Big questions.
It's definitely a mind-bending thought experiment. We'll explore these questions more when we come back for part 2 of our reism deep dive.
Welcome back to our reism deep dive. It might seem like a very niche philosophical idea, but it really gets under your skin, doesn't it? It makes you question some pretty basic assumptions.
I know what you mean. I've been thinking about those, what are they called?
Onomatoids.
Onomatoids, yes. It's like Kotorbisky is giving us this warning about language.
Right.
Like, watch out, those abstract terms can lead you down a rabbit hole.
I think that's a good way to put it. It highlights this emphasis on clarity and precision that's so central to reism. Remember, Kotorbisky was worried that imprecise language, especially language loaded with abstract terms, could actually, distort our thinking.
So it's not just about good grammar. It's about making sure our words are actually connected to something real, something solid.
Right. It's like, imagine you're trying to build an argument, but the words you're using are slippery. They keep shifting their meaning, and you can never quite pin them down.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. It's just going to collapse eventually.
Exactly. And that's where Kotorbisky's call for a more reistic language comes in. By sticking to concrete, observable things, we can create a much more stable foundation for our thinking.
Okay, I can see the appeal of that. But I'm curious, how do we actually put this into practice? Can you give me a real-world example of how we could use this Ratinistic approach to tackle a philosophical problem?
Sure, let's take the concept of mind. It's been a huge source of debate in philosophy for centuries. You have the dualists, who believe the mind is separate from the body, some kind of non-physical entity. Then you have the materialists who say the mind is just a product of the brain, nothing more.
Classic philosophical battle, mind versus matter.
Huh.
But how would a reist wade into this debate?
Well, instead of getting tangled up in these abstract arguments about what the mind is, a racist would likely shift the focus. They'd look at observable behaviors, neural processes, the ways we interact with the world.
So it's less about what is the mind and more about how do brains actually work.
Exactly. By focusing on the tangible, observable stuff, we can avoid some of those metaphysical dead ends that often lead to more confusion than clarity.
I like that. It's like a Marie Kondo approach to philosophy.
Yeah.
Declutter your thinking by focusing on what you can actually see and measure.
Haha, I love that analogy. It's all about finding what sparks joy, and for a Reist, that's the stuff we can observe, measure, interact with in the physical world.
Okay, but what about those concepts that just seem inherently abstract, like justice or beauty? Are those completely off limits for a Reist? Because honestly, those things are important to us. We make moral judgments, we appreciate art, we experience emotions. To say those don't exist just doesn't feel right.
I understand where you're coming from. And even the most hardcore Reists recognize the challenges in applying their philosophy to these areas. They wouldn't necessarily say that these concepts are meaningless or that they have no value.
So how do they square those seemingly non-material things with this whole only things exist idea?
Well, one way is to try and ground those concepts in more concrete phenomena. For example, a Reist might argue that our sense of justice is actually rooted in our evolutionary history. It might have developed from the need for cooperation within a group and the creation of rules to ensure fairness.
So instead of justice being some abstract ideal floating around out there, it's more about specific behaviors and social structures that we've developed over time.
Right. It becomes something tangible, something we can study and analyze.
That's a different way to think about it. What about beauty? How would a Reist explain our experience of beauty?
They might say that our appreciation of beauty is actually connected to biological responses to certain stimuli. For example, certain colors, shapes, or patterns might trigger pleasure centers in the brain.
So it's less about beauty being some inherent quality in the object itself, and more about a subjective experience rooted in our biology.
That's one possible reassistic interpretation. Of course, these are just examples, and there's still a lot of debate about how to fully reconcile these non-material aspects of human experience with the core tenets of Reism.
Sounds like Reism is still a work in progress, even for its biggest fans.
In a way, yeah. But I think even if we don't fully subscribe to Reism, it offers some valuable insights. That emphasis on clarity, on rooting our ideas in the tangible world, I think that's something we can all learn from.
I agree. It's a good reminder to stay grounded. So as we wrap up this part of our realism journey, I want to leave our listener with a little thought experiment. Think of a concept that you find particularly abstract, something that tends to get lost in philosophical jargon, something like freedom, consciousness, or even time.
Yeah, pick something that feels slippery, hard to define.
Now, try applying a reistic lens to that concept. Can you ground it in concrete examples, observable phenomena, maybe even your own personal experiences? Can you rephrase your understanding of it in a way that avoids those vague, abstract terms and really focuses on the tangible aspects?
It's a fun exercise.
It is. And it can really help you clarify your thinking, even if you don't end up a full-blown rakist. It's all about expanding our philosophical toolkit. We'll delve deeper into the implications of Reism and explore some alternative philosophical perspectives when we return for the final part of our deep dive. And we're back for the final part of our Reism deep dive. It's been quite a journey exploring this idea that only things exist. We've seen where it came from, what it means, and even heard from some of its critics. But I think it's always good to step back and get a wider view. See where else we could go with this.
I totally agree. No philosophical idea lives in a vacuum. It's always part of a bigger conversation.
Exactly. So if Reism is all about simplifying, getting down to those basic things, what are some other philosophies that maybe take a different approach?
Well, if you want to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there's idealism.
Idealism. Remind me again, what's the main idea there?
Idealism says that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual even. It's the idea that consciousness, or mind, is the most basic element of existence.
So it's like a total flip of Reism. Reism is all about the material world, and idealism is saying, nope, it's all in the mind.
Exactly. For idealists, those abstract concepts that Reism tries so hard to get rid of, things like mind, consciousness, ideas, those are the very foundation of everything.
It's just wild how different philosophical systems can start from such different places.
It really is, and that's what makes these conversations so interesting. You have these different frameworks, different starting points that lead to totally different conclusions about, what's real and how the universe works.
So we have Reism on one side saying it's all about the things, and idealism on the other saying, no, it's all about the mind. What else is out there?
Another interesting contrast to Reism is pragmatism.
Pragmatism. Okay, I've heard that term, but I need a refresher. What's the basic idea?
Well, pragmatists aren't really hung up on absolute truth or strict metaphysical categories. They're much more focused on what ideas actually do, how they work in practice.
So it's less about what is real and more about what works.
Precisely. For a pragmatist, what a concept means depends on its practical effects. Is it useful? Does it help us solve problems or figure out how to act?
That's definitely a different approach than Reism, which is all about stripping things down, getting rid of all those abstract ideas to find the basic building blocks of reality.
You're right. It's a totally different way of looking at philosophical questions. A pragmatist might say, hey, if an idea is useful, if it helps us navigate the world, then that's all that matters.
And in a way, it seems like pragmatism might be a middle ground between Reism and idealism, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to see it. Pragmatists recognize that we live in a world that includes both material things and ideas. They see the value in both concrete experience and abstract thought.
So they're not trying to reduce everything to one category or the other. They're saying it's more complex than that.
Exactly. And that's an important perspective to keep in mind. Reism gives us this great tool for clarifying our thinking and our language, but we have to remember that it's not the only tool in the box.
It's like you wouldn't use a hammer for every single job, right?
Uh-huh, exactly.
Yeah.
Different philosophical approaches are like different lenses.
Yeah.
They give us different ways to see the world, different ways to frame those big questions and search for answers.
It's like philosophy is this giant buffet, and we can try a little bit of everything, taking what we like and leaving the rest.
I love that. And as you continue to explore philosophy, it's so important to stay open, keep looking at things from different angles and let your thinking grow and change.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Reism, what's the big takeaway for our listener? What should they leave with today?
Well, I think Reism is a really interesting and powerful philosophy. It pushes us to really think about what's real and to use language in a more precise way. But it's just one piece of the puzzle. There are other ways of looking at things. It's important to engage with those other viewpoints, embrace the complexity of the world, and most importantly, never stop asking those big questions about, what it all means.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this Reism adventure. Until next time.